I want to talk about plastics as a possible source of contamination in Anchorage Waterways. Looks like already we've seen plenty of images that represent plastic in the system here. I got kind of involved in plastic contamination by interaction with Chris Pallister, and getting involved with that, one of the questions is where is all this plastic and where is it hidden? And realistically, this is an image that kind of artistically shows that we have plastic hidden under all over our aquatic systems. In the marine environment, when Chris talks about that, you get a chance to see all that, but clearly the problem exists in the urban river water systems as well. So this is a good example of what you find when you go to Elizabeth Island Lake, where a lot of marine plastic debris gets carried in from the winter storms and are deposited in the stream. You can see all kinds of plastic particles, some of which are particles that were used for actual feedstock that produce plastic containers, and others are pieces of styrofoam and so forth. So you see this is what happens with the material that goes into the oceans. It goes out into the oceans either from streams or from ships, and then gets broken apart with time and biologically degraded as well. So over a long period of time, it does degrade. What the half-life of this material is, no one really knows. I haven't seen anything that indicates what the actual time frame is for this stuff to exist on the planet's surface. But eventually, I guess it will be buried and become part of the ocean debris. But the reality of it is, it does provide some kind of a contamination problem. This is an example of a sheet of plastic floating on top of the lake, where you can actually see the film because of the reflection of the sun here. And here's some information on the actual concentrations in the water here. So we looked at 6 different phthalate compounds, and these are measurements that were made at different depths and in different positions in the lake. And then, of course, there's also even one, number 5 there, is a measure of concentration around that sheen. And if you look at that, you'll notice that DEHP turns out to be the major contaminant that we saw in the system. Most of the other contaminant levels are just about at the detection level, but DEHP is significant in that particular location, and the highest concentration here is in the film. These are parts per billion level, but they're very, very low. However, that's when you actually look at the water concentration, it tends to be much lower than, say, concentrations in the plastic material itself or in organisms that are exposed to these concentrations. Phthalates, I just stuck this in here to show you what phthalate looks like from a chemistry point of view. It's basically an aromatic structure with some functional groups on the side of lots of oxygens, and there are specific R groups that are attached to that, and those all go along with the names that we see here. And then, of course, we have a specific molecular weight. So in the laboratory setting, we use this information to characterize what's present in samples that we're looking at. So plastic waste at a glance. Plastic reduction has been steadily increasing. Properties that make it commercially desirable also make it an environmental hazard. And we can see this in terms of impacts on all kinds of wildlife, for example. They're durable, long-lasting, buoyant, which allows for global transport. Much of what enters the oceans remains unmineralized. And of course, there's different levels of particle size. So you have macro size particles, which are greater than 5 millimeters, or microplastics, which are less than 5 millimeters. But the actual range for microplastics is quite dramatic and goes all the way down to nanoparticle size. So microplastics is the term that's used here for these small particles, but in reality, it's 6 orders of magnitude at least in terms of the particle size that we can see once you get down to the level of simple molecules like phthalates, for example. So 267 species worldwide have been shown to have ingest these materials. Ingestion of these plastics by seabirds tends to reduce their fitness. They usually end up dying from starvation because they come impacted by these plastic material. Of course, things can be smothered by sunken plastic debris or transported by invasive species can be associated with these materials as well. One of the things that's interesting is the last couple of years, people have actually started to look at these microplastics. What do they look like in terms of distribution and size? And so only recently have people gone out there and collected some of this material by actually running a some kind of a net through the water, and then isolating the actual particles and figure out what they are in terms of size and description. So this is an example of a classical separation scheme where people have collected water, beach, sand material, and so on, and then done filtration, isolation, and you can see the level of analytical technology that's applied here, all types of spectroscopy, even down to electron microscopy for really small particle size. So we're going from large particles down to the nanoparticle level to determine what's really present in these materials that are present in various sample types. So microplastics originate from two main sources: primary production particles, facial cleansers, scrubbers, exfoliants, plastic media used in air blasting, suitable size for injection by marine organisms without further degradation. So these really small particles are the worst case scenario, and if you actually, believe it or not, they've actually shown evidence of these particles in fish tissue, even grains of fish, and also in things like krill, for example. So these particles are all over the ocean, and they're having impact on organisms smaller than what you see as pictures of dead birds where they've been impacted by these particles and they die, but this is going on at much lower levels in the trophic systems. Weather breakdown on microplastics is the other source of macroplastics, cellular containers that go out there, which they break down and they produce these microparticles, and then bacteria and other things, sunlight, all play a role. So photodegradation from sunlight, mechanical action, microbiological action. In fact, people told me that you go out on the North Pacific or down to Hawaii and there's essentially huge flat collections of these materials, as large as some states, for example, and there's a whole series of animals and organisms that live under these things. So it's a whole interesting gyres in the gyres, yeah. So it's a very interesting problem from a global perspective. And of course there is a gyre here close to Alaska, which is where we see all these particles that Chris is going to be talking about later. So microplastics, a deployed study found plastics enrich, this is one of the problems, what are these environmental hazards associated with all this stuff? Well, it turns out that these microplastics also enrich, basically are enriched in hydrophobic contaminants. In other words, anything that's organic, non-polar will assimilate in these types. So they're collecting these materials and see where they can basically increase the concentration by 10 to the 6, for example. So small particles could have a reasonable concentration of these contaminants as well. Contaminants like chlorinated hydrocarbons, aliphatic, other aliphatic structures, and so forth. There has only been one study where they've actually shown a correlation between ingested plastic particles and PCBs, and that's with great seawater. So you can see that, or shearwaters, excuse me. So there has been very little done in terms of evaluating what's going on in terms of the impacts from the point of view of the chemical contaminants being carried. So only one paper has reported release of sorbed compounds after ingestion. So a simple digestive solution of surfactants in seawater was used for this and showed that absorption and desorption varied between the plastics that were contaminated with other hydrocarbons. So the presence of the surfactant caused a 20-fold increase in the desorption rate at an increased equilibrium concentration. So you could expect that, for example, in the waters that goes out of the creeks here in Anchorage, we would expect the plastics to be carrying contaminants from these road hazards that are running down the drains, for example. They would be assimilated into the plastics, carried out and get out into the inlet. Of course, along the way, they probably would be consumed by juvenile salmon and so forth, because a lot of our streams still do contain salmon at this point. So through much of the research research to date suggests that microplastics pose a risk of acting as a source of contaminants to marine organisms. There's still debate over this question, however, because no one's really looked at it in a serious way, but I think it's pretty clear, at least in my mind, that this is a problem. So research, one of the things we want to do is look at what's going on with the transfer of these organic compounds that are associated with plastics. And so we're looking at this in terms of artificial seawater and this simulated digestive fluids. So this is just an image showing that, guess what, fish eat these contaminated particles and they get into the fish. And of course, if the fish can handle it metabolically, it's not a big problem, but sometimes the other things occur along the way. For example, inside the fish, you have endocrine systems that are affected by it, and they can have a long-lasting impact on survival and so on. So our study that we're doing at UAA is basically to provide some basic knowledge on or evaluate the toxicity of plastics in these in marine wildlife, or of course we need to do this in the city water system as well. Evaluate the absorption and desorption of toxic substances from the marine debris. That is, how do these things get in and out of the system, and how is it affected by the presence inside of an organism? Does the presence of biological fluids accelerate transfer into the marine animals like fish or other kinds of organisms? And we want to evaluate the effect of phthalates on the immune system of salmon in particular. Why is that? Well, because salmon is a big deal in Alaska, and we'd like to know whether or not phthalates are actually impacting these organisms and reducing their survival rates. So, connection between plastic debris ingestion and toxic compound levels in marine organisms hasn't really been significantly studied. That was the reason why we got into this. Controlled in vitro experiments are being used to evaluate this process, that is the dissolution, equilibrium, and the actual kinetics of the toxic substances being transferred from these debris. And we're also hoping to perform some leaching and desorption experiments using solutions that mimic the digestive systems of marine organisms or any biological organism. And this kind of shows you some of the system that we're using for looking at uptake and for absorption and desorption of the compounds into plastics. This is a continuous flow system that my graduate student developed that actually allows us to look at how the compounds transfer from the salt water into the plastics, and then desorption from the plastics. And we hope to do the same thing with biological fluids that mimic these systems internally. So this is my graduate student, Ben Applegate, and he's working to better understand the absorption mechanisms, provide some basic knowledge to evaluate the toxicity of plastics to the marine wildlife, stimulate digestive fluids, or to study whether or not stimulation of digestive fluids will increase the rate of transfer. He uses a recirculating pump to simulate the uptake of the compounds of interest, and he's evaluating this process. So this is an example of transfer of phenanthrene, which is a polyaromatic hydrocarbon, between the plastics, showing the uptake and then the release, and the actual model, a mathematical model that shows how this process is at work. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but if you're interested, I can tell you about that. Now, sources of phthalates, where do these things really come from? It turns out that phthalates are present in softeners for plastics, oily substances for fumes, additives for hairspray, lubricants, wood finishes, and probably that bottle of spray that kids were using to clean up cars. And that may be why that little thing was written on there about not letting you go down the sewer, because it turns out that a lot of things we use now are full of nanoplastic material, and that's basically work as surfactants. And where do they go? Well, they either go to the stream if you're using them externally, or they go down the sewer. So ultimately, they end up going through the Anchorage wastewater system and into Cook Inlet for the most part. Otherwise, they go if you're using them to wash your car or apply soaps and things to other cleaning agents to wash down your house, they end up going into the environment. So they're all over now, and the Food and Drug Administration doesn't really regulate those. It just simply is working with the companies, and basically they take advice from them and follow those procedures. They don't really regulate the use of nanoplastics at this time. So anyway, new car smell. It becomes especially pungent after the cars are sitting in the sun for a few hours. Partly the pungent odor is coming from phthalates that are volatilizing the hot plastic, so that's another source, just to show you. But all these things that we see here, all these pictures contain some kind of plastic material that can be released once you dispose of the container. Some of those things are embedded in the actual products themselves, and then of course canned goods have bisphenol A as a coating, as one of the chemicals that are in the coating that protects the can from releasing metals and oxidizing your food. So what are the proposed problems that people have observed about toxicity of phthalates. And a lot of this work was done by Greg. Hormone disruption, genital defects, breast and prostate cancer, brain alterations during development, and obesity and diabetes. These are all things that have been identified associated with phthalate exposure. So I'll stop there.